Before we get started, let me take a moment or two to answer some of the comments that were generated from our last Saturn diesel video. In part 8 of the Kubota Saturn experiment, we made some questionable aerodynamic mods, and a lot of folks didn't like the way I covered the gaping hole in the front bumper. And I'll admit, I'm no expert in this sort of stuff, but this was the best I could do. The bumper modification cost nearly $12 and took about an hour to accomplish. I guess it's obvious we didn't try too hard, and that's kind of the way it goes sometimes. This channel tends to focus on what's under the hood because that's what we do best. There was certainly a lot of suggestions and advice given in the comments section to improve aerodynamics, but keep in mind, and I mentioned this twice in the last episode, we're trying to keep the outside of the car looking as normal as possible to avoid attracting the attention of the rozzers. Whether or not the front bumper thingy helps or hurts the aerodynamics, it needs to stay in place for now because it blocks the airflow to the radiator and helps keep the engine at a stable temperature. The next item folks complained about was the fact that I removed the rear wing from the car. Apparently, the wing may help reduce drag by separating the air as it flows over the rear deck lid, or something like that. So, by popular demand, the wing will be reunited with the car, and I'm glad because I really like this wing. Now, nobody complained that I removed the passenger side mirror, so at least we did something right. But at the same time, nobody pointed out that the useless radio antenna should be removed. Yeah, this thing is definitely slowing the car down, so we removed it. Speaking about making the car go faster, someone suggested that we paint racing stripes on the car to improve performance. This, of course, is an excellent idea. The painted stripe modification works great on Shelby Mustangs and Camaros. And even though it's a fantastic idea, it also requires some degree of effort. Meh. Low effort with big results is what I'm after, so we took a page from the Honda Civic crowd and installed high performance stickers on the car. Each sticker is good for 10 horsepower, I think? I'm not really sure. So the last time we road tested the car, we got mixed results, and what I mean by that is the engine made more power, but at the same time it wasn't running the way we expected. I know that sounds a bit confusing because we made power and we lost power at the same time. Now there could be a number of reasons for the issues we encountered, but I have a feeling it's in the fuel system, so that's where we're going to start. This car is set up with a very simple system to deliver fuel to the Kubota engine. One of the shortcuts we took when building the car was not putting in a proper fuel filter and water trap, so this was our first step in troubleshooting the performance problems. So now the car has been fitted with a decent filter and a water trap. This filter is actually pretty heavy, so we fabricated the mounting brackets from a 1/4-inch steel plate, and they've been welded on both sides. I think it's safe to say the filter system's securely mounted. Let's take another look in the trunk and see what else we can do. Well, this little $12 fuel pump is a bit noisy, but that's how they normally sound. I reckon we need to do some testing and see if there's any problems with it. Let's take a look at the cartoon to get the big picture. Alright, that's better. So this is pretty simple. The 4-gallon fuel tank gravity feeds the cheapo fuel pump. Now I've been calling this the fuel pump, and while that's technically correct, this is actually the transfer pump. So the transfer pump is just a low pressure pump that transfers fuel from the tank to the high pressure injection pump on the diesel engine. Anyway, the transfer pump pushes fuel through this pre-filter and then goes through the larger filter and water separator. And then finally the fuel ends up at the high pressure injector pump. We suspect that there may be a problem with this pump, and in order to test the pump, we disconnected the fuel line from the diesel engine and installed a temporary return line back to the fuel tank. That way we can continuously pump the fuel around and around while we test the pump. Let's go back to the previous picture. If you notice, the fuel line deadheads right at the injector pump, and we normally don't have a return line. So what that means is, when we test the transfer pump in our temporary loop, we need to put a load on the pump by restricting the flow. And to do that, we'll use a pair of vice grips to squeeze the fuel line. That's the theory. Let's see how this actually works in practice. So the temporary return line is connected to the filter water separator and loops back to the trunk of the car. And here's the fuel line with the vice grip squeezing down and providing significant back pressure to the transfer pump. Now we let the system run for well over an hour, and that's so we can induce some stress on the transfer pump. And if the pump is borderline, we should be able to detect it. Like I mentioned a moment ago, this system's been pumping away for well over an hour. Let's do a quick test and see how fast we can pump 200 milliliters of fuel. Now keep in mind the cheapo transfer pump can certainly move significantly more fuel, and we're restricting the flow with the vice grips. Okay, well that took a while. Next we'll let the system cool down for about an hour and try it again. It would seem the performance of the transfer pump is more or less the same whether the system's hot or cold, so the pump is likely good. Next, we submerge the output of the fuel line into a tub of fuel and let the system pump. What we're looking for is air bubbles, and nothing, no bubbles. I think this transfer pump is most likely adequate for the application we're using it for, and the propaganda that came with the pump did indicate it was compatible with diesel fuel. Well, just for fun, let's toss the old transfer pump and install a fancy green one that costs $23. This one even has the word diesel written on it. The difference between these pumps is more than you think. The old pump used an electromagnet with a diaphragm to push the fuel, and this shiny new pump uses a turbine impeller. Fast forward a bit and the new pump is installed and powered up. The pump is a lot quieter, and well, I sort of like that. Let's see how it flows. Now keep in mind this is the same test setup, and right away we can tell this pump is more powerful and flows significantly more fuel. Even though this pump flows better under a load, it isn't any better than the previous pump. You see, both this pump and the old pump flow way more fuel than the engine can consume. In all likelihood, the old pump was probably fine as far as fuel flow goes, but I'm not sure how reliable it was. One more thing before we move on. During the testing of the transfer pumps, the fuel's been circulating from the tank to the water separator and back to the tank for about an hour and a half. At this point, any water in the fuel would have ended up in the water trap, and thankfully we're not showing one drop of water in the trap, so we can more or less rule out water as the source of our problem. Let's see what else we can fiddle around with. So over on the back side of the engine we have this tiny air filter. Let's take a closer look at it. Well, it doesn't look dirty, but it does seem a bit on the small side. I reckon we should replace this with something. This rubber coupler that I found fits the intake manifold perfectly, and after digging around in the box of misfit turbo parts, I found enough junk to build a legitimate cold air intake system. Let's fast forward a minute or two and take a look at what I managed to build. Yeah, it's way bigger than we need, but it was more or less free. For the air filter, I ended up using the original filter box that came with this car and did a bit of trimming and whatnot. This cold air system is definitely oversized, and the velocity of the air going through it will be a lot slower. And I guess it's possible that the air can actually pick up heat from the engine compartment. The good news is, this is just a temporary intake system, and we'll change it once we install the turbo. So we have a cold air intake, trunk spoiler, antenna delete, new transfer pump, and last but not least, 140 horsepower worth of stickers on the side window. That's a lot of power. Let's take the car back to the Hillbilly Proving Grounds and do some testing. So right away I can tell the car is a bit more zippy and able to get out of its own way. That's interesting. Now don't get me wrong, this car is still slow. Here, let's take a look at the Robot Cantina performance chart. So we're over here on the chart, and basically the car performs like a garbage truck, which is actually a lot better than before. At some point I like to get closer to here, and that may happen when we install the turbo. Look at this guy zipping around in his oversized lawnmower. I'm pretty sure we could take him in a drag race if it ever came down to that. So the fuel rack on the engine is adjusted to allow maximum power while still having a visibly clean exhaust. Unfortunately, if the car is pushed too hard, the exhaust gas temperatures will rise and trigger the alarm on this gauge. Right now we have the alarm set to go off at 950 degrees Fahrenheit, so we're well within the safety zone for now. Alright, the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's see if we made any improvements as far as acceleration goes. Someone requested that I also provide weather information on the tests, and yep, I can do that. So here's an info screen showing the temperature and wind conditions. Also something to note is the fuel rack adjustment. We covered how the rack was adjusted in the previous video, and it's currently set to 32 millimeters, which provides the most amount of power while still having a visibly clean exhaust. So this of course is our timer, and the best acceleration to date is 1 minute and 6 seconds to get to 55 miles per hour, which is significantly slower than a garbage truck. Let's see if we can beat that time. So at this point we're going for top speed, and let me speed this video up a bit. And we managed to get to 67 miles per hour before we ran out of road. The exhaust gas temperature gauge indicated that we're at 1160 degrees Fahrenheit. Running out of road pretty much kept us from going any faster, and we need to go faster. The solution was to move the starting point for the high-speed run so we would have a few extra miles to get the car up to speed. Now this time around, I'm sort of easing into the throttle in order to keep the exhaust temperatures down. And would you look at that, 71 miles per hour before we ran out of road again. It took nearly 4 miles to get up to that speed, so keep that in mind. Even though I tried to manage the exhaust gas temperature, the gauge was showing 1250 degrees Fahrenheit, which may be in the danger zone for this little industrial engine. So it's a good thing we ran out of road. Anyway, after we completed the performance testing, we headed back to the shop and topped off the fuel tank for the fuel economy run. We also adjusted the fuel rack for a little bit less fuel. We adjusted the rack limit screw from 32mm to 33mm. Now this wasn't done for fuel economy. We did it to help keep the exhaust gas temperatures below 1050 degrees while cruising in 5th gear. The engine still made power, but with this setting the top speed was most likely reduced. For the fuel economy test, we tried to maintain a speed of 60 miles per hour on the rural back roads, and we didn't make any attempt to economize. Let's look at the data. We need to check a few things before we can review the data. I'm sure some of you folks may have heard the noisy wheel bearing during our testing, so this left front wheel doesn't have an issue with the wheel bearing, but I want to get an idea how warm the rim is. Let's check the other side. Yeah, this rim feels about the same. I'll check the hub in a moment, but first let's look under the hood. So right away I don't feel any heat radiating from the engine compartment, and that's good. Let's check the valve cover. Yeah, the valve cover is hot, and that's normal because we just completed an hour and a half of driving. The intake tube feels cold to the touch, and the heater hoses are hot, and that's to be expected. The firewall is actually cold to the touch. And the air filter is cold. Actually, everything except the engine is cold. Now, keep in mind it's winter here in Kansas, and right now it's 49 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Let's check that right front wheel hub that has the noisy wheel bearing. Meh, it's colder than the rim, so no worries here. So yeah, this car has a noisy wheel bearing, and at some point it should be replaced. But right now I don't think it's an issue with performance or fuel economy. Oh boy, I can hear the comments now. Before you start typing away, try to wrap your head around this. In order for the noisy wheel bearing to dramatically affect our tests, there would have to be a serious amount of friction going on, and I don't see any evidence of that. The wheel and the hub feel normal to me as far as temperature goes. And yeah, the wheel bearing will eventually fail, but in my experience, this car will go another 5,000 to 10,000 miles before things get serious. And I'd like to avoid replacing the wheel bearing because ultimately this car is headed for the scrapyard. I think for now we can just add this to the long list of things that are wrong with the car, and if it makes you folks feel better, we'll keep an eye on it. Let's look at the performance and fuel economy data. So the best 0 to 55 mile per hour time we recorded was a lazy 1 minute and 6 seconds. Today we shattered that record and did 0 to 55 in a mind-bending 40 seconds. That works out to be about a 25-second difference, give or take. Not bad at all. So you gotta ask yourself, was it the front bumper, the rear wing, antenna delete, new fuel pump, fuel rack adjustment, cold air intake, or was it the stickers? Well, we made too many changes. However, the one thing we do know for sure is the fuel rack adjustment played a big part in today's epic 0 to 55 mile per hour speed run. Normally, when it takes 40 seconds to get to 55 miles per hour, well, that's not good, but today we'll make an exception. So how'd we do on the fuel economy? Let's find out. Some basic info for the folks that are concerned, and down here is something to note. The fuel rack was adjusted prior to the fuel economy run, and the sole purpose of that adjustment was to lower the exhaust gas temperatures at cruising speed. On our previous fuel economy run, we managed to squeeze out 56 miles per US gallon. That's a decent number by all regards. Now here's something to consider. At the time we did that test, the car didn't have enough power to be driven in 5th gear at 55 miles per hour. So that test was conducted in 4th gear, and the engine was spinning around 3,000 RPM at 55 miles per hour. Now keep in mind the car is equipped with a Saturn MP3 close ratio transmission, and that provides the little diesel engine a range of gear ratios that are better suited for its power curve. In today's test, even though we trimmed the fuel rack back a couple of notches, the engine had plenty of power to cruise in 5th gear, and that made for a more pleasant ride. So cruising in 5th gear at 60 miles per hour, the engine was spinning exactly at 2,500 RPM, which by the way is where the engine generates peak torque. So today we managed to squeeze 59 miles per US gallon out of this 2,080-pound car. Not too shabby. Now it's important to remember, we didn't try to economize when driving. However, the exhaust gas temperatures were closely monitored and every effort was made to keep the temperatures below 1,050 degrees. So on this normally aspirated diesel engine, less heat means less fuel. I think as far as performance goes, this engine's maxed out because the exhaust gas temperatures are getting closer and closer to the danger zone. And that's because the fuel rack is adjusted way past the factory settings. And I reckon the only way to lower the exhaust gas temperatures is to install a turbocharger. As I understand it on a diesel engine, the boost provided by the turbo will put the air-fuel ratio back in balance and the exhaust gas temperatures should come back down. And as a bonus, we get more power. Oh, here's a sneak peek at what we're doing right now in the shop. Yep, that's a turbo. So this project just got more interesting, and now is a great time to subscribe because our next goal is to go from here to here, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Until next time.